3 days after my daughters were born, my mother-in-law walked into my hospital room with a check and a man in a suit, and she asked me to disappear. I still had an 4-line in my arm. The room smelled like antiseptic and newborn skin. My twin girls were sleeping against me, one on each side, warm and impossibly small. And Eleanor Caldwell stood at the foot of my bed like a verdict, her silver hair pinned back, her posture carved from granite, and behind her, a woman I'd never seen before was setting down a designer bag on my bedside chair as though she already lived in my house. Eleanor's attorney, a thin, careful man named Douglas Hatch, opened a leather folder on my meal tray. She uncapped a heavy gold pen. The sound of it cut through everything. 2 signatures, she said pleasantly. 1 for the settlement. 1 to let us raise them properly. $18 million, and you walk away comfortable and free. I looked at the documents. I looked at my daughters. I looked at the woman behind Eleanor who had come to collect my children and my life. And I signed. Then I did the one thing no one in that room had budgeted for. I picked up my girls, and I walked out. By the time their legal team arrived at the office the next morning, the most expensive piece of paper Eleanor Caldwell had ever purchased was worth exactly nothing. My name is Nadia Tumirashid. I'm 34 years old, and for 9 years I've been a credentialed actuary, which means I spend my days doing math that makes people uncomfortable. I calculate how long people live, how much their care will cost, whether a company has set aside enough money to keep the promises it's made. It's quiet work. It doesn't trend on social media, but it is precise, and precision has a way of outlasting everything else. My father ran a small insurance agency out of a strip mall in Ohio. He was the kind of man who fixed things instead of complaining about them, and the last real lesson he gave me before he died came in a single sentence. The numbers don't lie, Nadia. Figure out which one you're looking at. So I learned to read beneath the surface. I learned to hold still when the pressure was highest, because panic is just miscalculation in motion. When colleagues got loud in meetings, I got quieter and more precise. My coworkers thought it was a personality flaw. The Caldwells would eventually learn it was the most dangerous thing in the room. I met Marcus Caldwell at an industry conference in Boston. He was the kind of handsome that felt effortless, charming without trying, and I confused that ease for depth. He told me his family ran a long-term care insurance company his grandfather had built. He didn't mention that his mother ran him. We were married 18 months later. I kept my professional licenses under my birth name, habit, not strategy, though I'd come to appreciate the difference. The first time I walked into Caldwell House, a colonial estate above the river with gardens too formal to enjoy, I understood my position before I'd finished my first drink. Eleanor greeted me with a smile that never arrived in her eyes. The house smelled of her rose and cedar perfume, a scent so deliberately cultivated it felt like a declaration. Her late husband's portrait hung at the top of the main staircase, and every decision in the house seemed to pass through it. The board deferred to Eleanor. Marcus deferred to Eleanor. I learned to be pleasant and easy to overlook at their dinners, which suited me. I am not a performer. I had my career, my marriage, and a future I believed I could map. For 3 years I told myself the coldness was old money being old money, that I was an outsider who would slowly earn her way in. I was good at numbers. I'd been worse at that particular equation. Then I got pregnant, and Eleanor started attending to me with a warmth that made my skin prickle. She'd rest her hand on my stomach without asking. She called the twins the next generation of Caldwells, with a satisfaction that felt less like love and more like ownership. I told myself I was being uncharitable. I was not. People imagine betrayal arrives without warning. Mine came with footnotes. Marcus started working late, then later still. His voice on phone calls acquired a gentleness he'd never used with me. A tone is data, and this one told me something. Then money moved. A transfer left our joint account in an amount that didn't match any bill or investment I knew of, routing to somewhere I'd never seen. I asked him about it plainly. He said it was a business thing and studied his dinner plate. I don't trust dinner plates. So I did what I do. I hedged. I opened a personal account and moved a quiet cushion into it. I made copies of every financial record I had legal access to, bank statements, mortgage documents, brokerage accounts, policies. I packed a hospital bag and a second bag I kept near the front door, unlabeled. I even started reading Caldwell Providence public filings again at night, the statutory statements every insurer files with the state. I'd skimmed them before our wedding and set them aside with an uneasy feeling I'd told myself was nothing. I still couldn't close the joint account. It needed both our signatures, and the day I would have forced the conversation, my contractions started. That's the cruelty of timing. I saw the wave. I just couldn't get clear of the shore. The girls came on a Wednesday morning, both of them, the long old-fashioned way. I named them myself, before anyone could weigh in, Clover and Rue. Small names. My names. Nothing that echoed a century of Caldwell men. Marcus arrived after, faintly perfumed with someone else's evening, and held them like borrowed things. The person who actually held my hand was Greta Mendez, my old professional mentor, a retired actuary who'd spent years inside a state insurance regulatory office before she taught me everything worth knowing. She drove 90 minutes without being asked and did not leave. When the paperwork came, I listed the girls under my last name. Marcus didn't notice. Eleanor wasn't there yet. For 3 days it was only us, 2 sleeping weights, one calm and one restless, both of them quieting when I hummed off key, which I always am. I told myself the worst was nearly past. That whatever was unraveling in my marriage could be addressed later, with rest and a lawyer and space. I have better instincts about spreadsheets than I do about hope. Because on the third morning, the smell of rose and cedar arrived before she did. Eleanor came first. Then Marcus. Then the woman, Priya. Eleanor introduced her, in the flat tone of a CEO naming a successor. Priya set her bag down on my chair the way you claim a thing. Hatch spread the folder open on my tray. Divorce papers. A settlement. And beneath them, a parental relinquishment, 2 thick lines waiting for me to erase myself from my daughters' lives. Hatch used the word binding 3 times in his opening paragraph. Eleanor sat on the edge of my hospital bed without being invited and uncapped her gold pen. The click was a small, clean sound, and I felt it in my sternum. You were a lovely addition to the family, Nadia. But you were always a transition. She slid the check across the blanket like she was settling a tab. 18 million. Both signatures. You'll be comfortable, you'll be free, and the girls will have everything they deserve. She tapped the relinquishment. Fight this, and I will spend the next decade watching my lawyers explain to a judge why a woman obsessed with money and risk is unsuitable to raise Caldwell heirs. She let the silence expand. And in that silence, I understood precisely what my twins were worth to her. Not sentiment. Control. Marcus's father had structured the family trust so that stewardship of the company and the chairmanship passed through bloodline heirs and whoever raised them while they were young. Marcus was, by Eleanor's own assessment, a weak vessel. But 2 fifth-generation Caldwell girls, raised under her name and her hand, meant Eleanor retained command of the enterprise for another 20 years. 18 million to lock that in and remove a sharp-eyed woman from the equation wasn't generosity. It was actuarial. The cedar and rose was everywhere. Clover stirred against my arm. I looked at Hatch's folder and felt something ancient settle in me, the particular stillness I get when a number is pretending to be something it isn't. He had handed me his wall and invited me to test it. So I tested it. People always ask how you could sign away your own children, and I understand why the question feels necessary. Here is the answer, because the answer is everything. While Eleanor spoke, my mind ran 3 numbers. First, a document signed in a hospital bed, under duress, without a judge, is not a legal surrender of parental rights. In most states, a valid relinquishment requires an oath before a court, a judge's certification on the record that the parent understood what they were giving up. Hatch's folder had no judge in it. It had pressure and a gold pen. Second, no one can purchase a child. Custody is not a deed of sale. A family court decides who raises a child by a single standard, that child's best interest, and a checkbook has no standing in that argument. A judge speaks last, not Eleanor. Third and simplest, I was their mother. No order anywhere said I couldn't leave a hospital with my own newborns. So the real math resolved cleanly. If I refused, they'd keep me tangled in courts for years and outspend me until I buckled. If I signed, I'd walk out with $18 million, 2 daughters, and a document they believed was a cage and I knew was tissue paper. I would take their money, take my girls, and come apart their foundation later, on my terms, with the one instrument they had never thought to fear. I picked up her pen. I signed Marcus Caldwell's name for the last time, slowly and deliberately. Then I set the pen down and reached for my daughters. "We're finished," I said. We were. Just not the way they imagined. There was no dramatic exit. Drama belongs to people without a plan. I waited until the floor quieted, until visiting hours thinned and the hallway went dim. The hospital had already cleared me for discharge. I was sore and slow, but my arms worked, and Clover and Rue weighed almost nothing. I called Greta. She was in the parking structure in 15 minutes because I'd asked her that morning to stay within range. Another hedge I'd despised needing. I couldn't drive. 3 days postpartum, not a chance. I secured 2 infant carriers into Greta's car with hands that barely trembled, and we drove away from the hospital, away from Hatch and Eleanor and the cedar smell, to a furnished apartment 2 towns away in a place called Ferris Landing. I'd signed the lease 6 weeks earlier under my own name and told absolutely no one. The bag by the door was already there. On the drive, while Clover slept and Rue studied the passing streetlights with enormous dark eyes, I composed a letter in my head. Measured. Documented. A formal notice of revocation, sent by registered mail at the next business morning's opening, rescinding the relinquishment I'd signed under clear duress and demanding the Caldwells cease treating it as valid. Quiet. Dated. Tracked. If you've ever been the still one in a room full of people who assumed your silence was submission, you already know the truth they always learn too late. Calm isn't concession. It's a fuse. I wasn't running from the Caldwells that night. Running is for people who are afraid. I was repositioning, moving capital before the market turns, getting my daughters out of reach so that when the floor gave way, it gave way beneath them and not beneath us. By morning, the panic had entirely reversed. I learned its shape later from Marcus, who cannot contain himself when he's frightened. Hatch arrived early to file the relinquishment somewhere official and discovered there was nowhere to file it. It wasn't a court order. It had never been before a judge. In its current form, it was a document a postpartum woman had signed under coercion in a hospital room while her husband's girlfriend stood watching, a near-textbook case of duress, which any competent judge could void with a sentence. And my registered letter was already moving through the mail, revoking everything in writing, dated the previous evening, tracked end to end. No children had been taken. I had simply left a hospital with my own daughters, which is a thing mothers are permitted to do. Eleanor called at 10:30. I nearly didn't pick up. When I did, her voice had lost its marble polish. "Nadia," she said, "let's be adults about this." It was the first time I had ever heard her ask rather than instruct. I kept my voice as level as I keep it when a client is melting down over an unfavorable projection. "I am being an adult about it," I told her. "I have my daughters, and I have your money. That is the most sensible outcome available." She began to threaten. I ended the call. I sat on the floor of a borrowed apartment with 2 babies on a blanket in front of me, and I made a list, the only celebration my nervous system is capable of. $18 million had purchased the Caldwells exactly nothing. No grandchildren, no silence, no clean ending. And it had purchased me the one thing they'd never once given, time to think. The obvious move was a custody attorney and a courtroom. So I started there. I found Simona J., a family law attorney whose reputation was built on not flinching, and I laid everything out across her conference table while Greta watched the girls in the next room. Ajay read the relinquishment, then read it again, then set it aside with an expression like she'd found mold. "This document has no legal teeth," she said. "Signed under duress, no judicial oversight," the other woman literally in the room. "I could have this set aside before lunch." I exhaled for the first time in days. Then she leaned back. "But hear me clearly. They have 3 generations of accumulated money. If Eleanor decides to make custody a prolonged fight, she can drag it out for years on motions alone and burn through more money than most people earn in a decade. They'll commission someone to paint you cold, calculating, unsuitable. They'll likely lose in the end." Likely isn't a word a mother sleeps well on. She wasn't frightening me. She was respecting me enough to be accurate. I asked what I already half knew the answer to. "So I win slowly and bleed the entire time?" Ajay nodded. "Or you find a way to make them want this over more than you want it." I drove back to Ferris Landing, turning that over. I am an actuary. I don't fight on the field that benefits the house. I started doing different math. I spent a few weeks considering the easy version of revenge. The affair. It was almost gift-wrapped. Marcus and Priya had been strikingly careless. People convinced they're getting away with something usually are. I had months of his distraction, hotel charges, a jewelry receipt, a thread of forwarded messages a mutual friend had sent me before I'd even suspected, sick of watching me play a fool. Nothing recorded improperly. Nothing I'd hesitate to show a judge. Just the ordinary, careless residue of 2 selfish people. I imagined releasing it, sending it to the board, to Eleanor's social circle, to the business journals that ran Caldwell family profiles every spring. I imagined the satisfaction with genuine clarity, and it was warm, and it lasted in my mind for about a long weekend before I saw the flaw. Humiliating Marcus would only humiliate Marcus. Eleanor would absorb a scandal the way she'd absorbed everything else, by covering it in perfume and waiting for the next news cycle. Priya would recover. And none of it touched the actual threat to my daughters, which was never the affair. The affair was merely the symptom. The disease was the money. The Caldwell money was what let Eleanor imagine she could purchase my children in a hospital room. The affair was a knife, and I didn't need to cut Marcus. I needed to cut the thing that made all 3 of them feel unreachable. I put the folder in a drawer. Not out of nobility. Because exposing an affair feels good for 10 days, and I wanted something that lasted a lifetime. What holds people like this upright? That was the question that changed everything, and I want you to understand why, because it's where this stops being a marriage story. My daughters would not be permanently safe because I might prevail in a custody hearing. They would be safe only as long as the Caldwells lacked the financial power to grind me into compliance. And the Caldwells' power had exactly one source. Not Eleanor's force of personality. Not Hatch's confident documents. Not the portrait at the top of the stairs. It was Caldwell Provident, the company, the 100-year enterprise, the river of wealth that everything else floated upon. Remove the river and Eleanor was just a frightened woman with a gold pen. So I stopped looking at her as my mother-in-law. I started looking at Caldwell Provident the way I look at any company that hires me, as a balance sheet, a set of promises measured against the money reserved to keep them. And the moment I put that lens on, the old discomfort came back. The itch I'd had even before the wedding. Those public filings that had never quite added up for me. I pulled out my copies of their statutory statements, the ones I'd half-read at night when I was only anxious and not yet clear on why. I made fresh coffee. I put the girls down. And I started reading Caldwell Provident the way my father taught me to read everything, slowly, from the bottom up, and with skepticism about anything that looks too clean. Let me explain what long-term care insurance actually requires, because this is where the story turns. A company like Caldwell Providence sells policies promising that when policyholders grow old and can no longer dress or bathe themselves, the company will pay for their care. The premium payments arrive for decades before most claims begin. During that gap, the insurer is supposed to accumulate enormous reserves, a genuine mountain of money held in trust against the care it has promised to fund. Actuaries test these reserves annually to verify the mountain is tall enough. The whole industry learned this lesson painfully a generation ago when people lived longer than anyone projected and care costs rose faster than anyone modeled. Honest companies adjusted. Dishonest ones papered over the gap and hoped. When I ran Caldwell's reserves against my own models, my stomach did what it does when a number is pretending to be something else. Their reserves were too thin. Not marginally. Not in a way that could be explained by methodology disagreements. Thin like a man promising dinner for 100 people from half a loaf, smiling while he promises it. Their mortality assumptions were too rosy. Their lapse rates, the rate at which policyholders stop paying and let their coverage lapse, relieving the company of future liability, were numbers no real population produces. On the surface, Caldwell Provident looked more financially healthy than nearly any comparable company. And that was exactly what was wrong. Health like that isn't earned. It's manufactured. They were promising more care than they had reserved the money to pay for, and reporting the gap as profit. That profit funded the house, the trust, the dynasty. And the dynasty was the threat to my daughters. Numbers don't get nervous. People do. And someone at Caldwell had been very nervous for a very long time. Among the financial records I'd copied before I ever left our house, documents that were legally mine, part of our marital financial picture, was a single page from Marcus's home office. He'd brought papers home regularly and left them in our shared study without much thought. Most of it was routine. One page was not. It was an internal asset adequacy worksheet, the kind of stress test a company runs to verify its reserves can survive realistic claim scenarios. It had 2 columns. The left showed the reserve figure Caldwell had filed with the state regulator. The right showed the reserve their own internal analysis determined was actually necessary. The difference between the 2 columns was staggering. And in the margin, in Marcus's precise handwriting, hold the line through the rate filing. Beneath that, 2 sets of initials, his and the company's appointed actuary. 2 columns. One truth filed with the state. One truth buried in a drawer. And my husband's initials acknowledging both. I sat with that page for a long time while the girls slept. I could have mailed it to a newspaper that evening. But I know how evidence works. A single out-of-context page from a spouse in a bitter divorce is almost nothing. A hostile expert dismisses it in an afternoon. It wasn't a weapon. It was a coordinate, a location where the body was buried. The digging was still mine to do. To make the case real, I would have to reconstruct the reserve shortfall from the outside, using only public information any citizen could access, so that my finding stood on its own without the borrowed page. The honest way. Until the number didn't need the secret document to be true. Something shifted in me that week, and I want to be honest about what it was, because it grew larger than my marriage. When I started, my anger was personal. They had hurt me and I wanted to respond. But you cannot stare at a reserve shortfall of that magnitude and keep it personal. Behind those thin reserves were thousands of real people. Most of them elderly. Many of them women on fixed incomes who had written their Caldwell check every month for 30 years on the faith that the money would be there when their bodies needed it. Somewhere out there, a woman who had paid into this system since before I was born was approaching the point where she'd need that care to function. And Eleanor had gambled that woman's security to keep the family looking wealthier than it was, to maintain the house, the board power, the dynasty, and when convenient, to buy a daughter-in-law's silence. That part one could not put back in the drawer. This stopped being a knife aimed at one unfaithful husband. It became something colder and wider, aimed at the lie itself, through the exact machinery built to expose it, so that no amount of Caldwell money could reframe it as a scorned woman's tantrum. I went back to Greta. We sat at her kitchen table, the girls in a playpen in the next room, my work spread between the coffee cups. I watched a former regulator's eyes move down my pages in silence. "You've built this cleanly," she said finally. "But you'll want to do the next piece exactly right, or they'll bury you in procedural delays." Then she walked me through the architecture. An actuary with documented credible concerns about an insurer's solvency can bring those concerns formally to the state insurance department. If the submission holds up to scrutiny, the commissioner has authority to open a financial examination, sending examiners in to demand the company's actual working papers, the internal documents that have to match what was filed. If the examination confirms inadequate reserves, the commissioner can petition a court for supervisory authority over the company. First conservatorship, potentially, then rehabilitation, where the state takes the wheel to attempt correction. And if the company can't be corrected, liquidation. Greta walked me through each threshold, each timeline, each trigger. She didn't write a word of my analysis. She didn't need to. She handed me something more valuable than a weapon. She handed me a blueprint of the building with the load-bearing wall marked in red. "If you're right," she said, tapping my shortfall figure, "you won't have to do anything to them. You'll just have to show the right people what's true, and the truth will do the rest." I looked at the number I'd rebuilt from public sources alone, the one that finally stood without the borrowed page. It matched. Honest math and hidden math, both arriving at the same answer across a kitchen table. I knew then it was real. Then came the long portion. The weeks that look nothing like revenge from the outside. The nights that look exactly like homework. I used some of the Caldwell money for the only thing it was actually good for, buying me the time and the tools to do this correctly. I licensed industry data. I acquired the actuarial mortality and lapse studies. I rented a desk in a quiet office, because I was not going to build a fraud case at a kitchen table with formula on my sleeve. And night after night, while Clover and Rue slept in the next room, I rebuilt Caldwell Provident's true reserve position from scratch, using only what a careful external analyst could access: their public statutory filings, industry benchmarks, standard actuarial guidelines that every licensed company in the country is required to follow. I tested every assumption, then tested them under harsher scenarios, then documented each step as though I expected a hostile expert to try to dismantle it with a flamethrower. The perfectionism that had made me strange my whole life, the over-responsibility, the inability to call a number close enough, the obsessiveness that my co-workers had always found excessive, stopped being a flaw. For the first time in my professional life, it was exactly the right condition to have. When I was finished, I had a reserve adequacy analysis that any regulator in the country could follow line by line. It stated, in calm and professional language, that Caldwell Provident carried a reserve deficiency in the hundreds of millions of dollars, and that its reported solvency was, in plain terms, a fabrication. I built it clean enough that even the appointed actuary who'd initialed that internal page could not credibly call my methodology a guess, because it wasn't one. Marcus found me before I filed. I should have anticipated it. People with something to hide can sense a reckoning the way animals sense weather. He came to the rented office one evening looking like a softened, older version of the man I'd married, and he tried 3 different versions of himself in 20 minutes. First, the husband. He missed me. He missed the girls. He'd been selfish and he knew it. I let that one expire in the air between us. Second, the negotiator. There was more available, he said, if I would sign something final and move forward. He named a larger number. I almost laughed. Then, when neither found purchase, the third version appeared, the one Eleanor had built. He stepped closer and his voice went quiet and flat. "Nadia, whatever you're doing, you need to stop. For your own sake. Not one word about the girls. Not a single syllable about custody, about parenting, about being a father. A man fighting for his children leads with his children. Marcus led with "Stop digging." He was terrified of what a licensed actuary with time and motive would find, because his own initials were on a page that described precisely what I had already found. "I'm not digging," I told him. "I'm finishing." He stared at me, and I saw real fear in his face, and I felt nothing sympathetic about it. He'd come to buy my silence and instead had confirmed, beyond any remaining doubt, that my silence was worth buying. Which meant two things. My numbers were right, and the one person who could have stopped me from inside was too frightened to do anything except beg. I nearly pitied him. Nearly. Eleanor came last, and she came differently than I'd prepared for, which is the only reason she earns this paragraph. She didn't bring Hatch. She arrived alone at a coffee shop in Ferris Landing, and for a few minutes she was not a chairman at all. She was a widow. She told me about her husband, how he'd built the company from 2 desks and borrowed capital, how he died with his name above the door and his trust in her to keep it bright. And then, in a voice stripped of all its marble, the confession underneath. The reserves had first gone thin years earlier, during a genuinely brutal stretch when the entire long-term care industry had been crushed by its own miscalculations. She had made a decision to paper over the gap, just until conditions improved. They never improved. So she held the line year after year, because telling the truth would not only sink the company, it would mean her husband's name lived forever beside the word fraud. And she could not allow him to die twice. For a full minute, I felt the pull of it. She was old. She was frightened. She had maintained a lie for so long it had become a person she felt obligated to protect. Then she set down her cup, and the marble returned. "Those children are Caldwell's, Nadia. They belong with that name. You were always a transitional arrangement. Transitional arrangements don't set terms." There it was. She would allow thousands of elderly strangers to lose the care they'd paid for, she would take my children to feed a dynasty, and she would call that maintaining a legacy. Whatever sympathy I'd been holding folded itself up and went quiet. For 60 seconds I had almost understood her. Then she reminded me that my daughters were inventory. So I filed. After everything, all the sleepless nights, the borrowed desk, the 100 tested assumptions, the months of deliberate quiet, the loudest thing I ever did to the Caldwells made no sound whatsoever. I packaged my analysis into a formal complaint to the state insurance department and mailed it by registered post. I also submitted it through the department's official digital channel and kept every confirmation. My name was on every page. I was not hiding. People who hide get dismissed. Greta reviewed my cover letter and changed 3 words, then nodded once. I didn't send it in fury. I sent it the way I send anything I've verified 100 times, with a flat, clean calm. I drove to the post office myself, and I sat in the parking lot afterward until my hands finally stopped moving. The quietest thing I had ever done. And somewhere down its chain of consequences, it was going to be the loudest. Because regulators cannot receive a credible, documented, methodologically sound solvency concern and look away. That is precisely why their office exists. The machine built to protect policyholders, the woman in the front row with her folder of statements, was about to begin moving under its own weight. And once it moved, it would move without me. I had found the load-bearing wall. All that remained was to step back and let the building realize what it was standing on. The department opened its financial examination faster than Greta had predicted, the way regulators move when the math is irrefutable and the policyholders are vulnerable. I heard the news the way the whole regional insurance market heard it. The state had sent examiners to Caldwell Provident requesting working papers and internal reserve analyses, the documents that had to match what was filed with the state, and of course, could not. You cannot maintain a line in a drawer when a state examiner asks to see both sides of the page simultaneously. The rumors spread immediately, because questions about an insurer's solvency don't stay contained in a small market. The company's manufactured health began to crack visibly. Its valuation shook. Marcus, I heard, stopped appearing at the office. Eleanor tried to characterize the examination as routine, nothing to worry about, a standard procedure, but people don't require reassurance when they aren't yet afraid. Priya, observing the man she'd chosen going pale and silent, began asking different questions about the origin of the Caldwell wealth. None of this needed me anymore. That was the architecture of doing it correctly. I had handed the truth to people whose professional obligation was to act on it, and it was acting now, under its own momentum, with a weight that no perfume or legacy or gold pen could slow. Eleanor had spent a lifetime building something she called a 100-year name. It took the state's examination 9 business days to ask the company the single question it had spent a generation evading. And there is no document, however beautifully drafted, that can write its way out of a reserve that was never actually there. Priya left first. I would be lying if I claimed there was no satisfaction in that. She had walked into my hospital room with a designer bag and a pitying expression, entirely certain she was the upgrade. She had staked her future on the Caldwell name the way you stake it on a sure thing without ever reading the prospectus. Now the sure thing was fracturing in real time, and Priya was nothing if not a pragmatist. She hadn't fallen for Marcus. She had fallen for what Marcus appeared to represent, a balance sheet. And the balance sheet was being sequestered. I heard she began spending less time at Caldwell House. Then she stopped returning his calls. Then she simply wasn't anywhere he was anymore, gone to find a more solvent situation to attach herself to, leaving him with a pending divorce, a mother in crisis, and a name that had become a liability column. There's a particular justice in that. Marcus had traded me for a woman who wanted what our marriage had looked like from the outside. The moment it stopped looking like wealth, she evaporated. He received the lesson I'd already paid full price to learn. The Caldwell fortune wasn't love, and it wasn't security. It was a story. And stories, like reserves, have to be funded by something real. Priya had wanted to marry a fortune. She just hadn't bothered to read what that fortune was built on, or how little of it actually existed. I didn't gloat. I had daughters to feed and a process to see through. But when I heard she'd left him standing in the rubble he'd helped construct, I gave myself the length of one warm bottle to smile. Eleanor, drowning, did what she'd always done. She tried to command her way out. She summoned me. Not through Hatch. Not through a settlement proposal. A personal summons, delivered through a shaken Marcus, to the company's annual policyholder meeting at the downtown headquarters, where she still imagined herself the woman who arranged every room she entered. The message was vintage Eleanor. Come. We can resolve this quietly before it becomes something larger. She still believed there was a number that would buy me, or a threat that would move me. She had not processed that I no longer had anything she could take. My daughters were with me. My money was my own. My case had been out of her reach since the morning I sat in a post office parking lot, willing my hands to stop shaking. She was inviting me to a negotiation that had concluded months ago. I said yes. Not because she had power over me, because I wanted to be in the room. There is a difference between revenge you inflict on someone and justice you simply stand beside while it arrives. I wanted to stand beside this. I wanted to be there when the truth I had rebuilt, line by honest line, walked into a room full of the people Eleanor had gambled and read them the actual numbers. She thought she was staging an ending she controlled. She was building the stage for the real one. I dressed simply, the way I always do. The clothes of a woman who works with numbers and doesn't need a costume. I arranged a sitter for the girls and drove downtown. The meeting was held in the ground floor hall at Caldwell Providence headquarters, the kind of room designed to make people feel safe about their money. Rows of chairs, a modest stage, a banner bearing the company's centennial seal. And the policyholders, filling every chair. Mostly older. Many of them couples who'd held these policies since before my parents met. Several using canes. A woman near the front held a folder of her own policy statements against her chest like something fragile. These were the real names behind the reserves. The retirees, the widows, the people whose care Eleanor had quietly placed at risk to sustain the appearance of a healthy balance sheet. Seeing them assembled made my resolve go very still and very cold. There were reporters, too, a handful of local press, because solvency rumors draw them the way weather draws weather watchers. Board members sat stiffly to one side, sensing something they hadn't been told yet. And Eleanor at the front, in her full armor, pearls, the impenetrable cedar and rose, posture carved from 2 generations of inherited authority. Her gold pen lay on the podium beside her notes like a prop. She had arranged the entire room to project stability. Every chair and banner positioned to say, "Nothing is wrong here." She caught my eye as I settled into a seat near the back and gave me a small, certain smile, the smile of a woman who believes she still controls the arithmetic of every room she enters. I held her gaze and felt nothing but calm. She had built a stage. She just didn't realize she'd built it for both of us. Eleanor opened the meeting the way she'd opened 100 others, with a measured, unhurried cadence of someone who has never questioned her own authority. She thanked the loyal policyholders. She acknowledged the rumors with an indulgent little smile and called them competitive noise, the noise of people who couldn't build what this family had built. She promised a record year. She used the word strong 4 times, which is 3 more times than a genuinely strong company requires. Then the side door opened, and the temperature in the room shifted before anyone understood why. 2 people entered. A woman in a plain suit with a state lanyard. A colleague carrying a banker's box of documents. The examiner. Eleanor's sentence dissolved at the podium. The woman didn't raise her voice. Regulators rarely do. She introduced herself by title and department and stated, in the flat language of institutional process, that following the financial examination of Caldwell Provident, the commissioner had petitioned the court for supervisory authority, and the company was being placed under state supervision effective immediately, with new business suspended pending further proceedings. She said it the way I would have said it, as a fact already true. A sound moved through the rows, not quite a cry, not quite a gasp, something between them. The woman with the policy folder pressed it harder to her chest. The board members went rigid. A reporter's pen started moving fast. And Eleanor stood frozen at her own podium, the record year speech still half in her mouth as the actual record arrived in a cardboard box carried by a stranger. For one suspended moment, nobody moved. The centennial seal hung on the banner above her head, gleaming, suddenly ironic. The strength she had assembled the room to display had no reserves beneath it, and now, in front of every person she had lied to, the floor was caving in. Then she broke. I want you to notice who stayed still and who fell apart, because that was the entire inversion I had been building toward. She did not absorb it with grace. The polish cracked all at once. She gripped the podium, and her voice climbed into registers I'd never heard from her, sharp and furious, demanding to know who had orchestrated this, calling it a smear, the work of jealous outsiders who wanted what the Caldwells had spent a century constructing. Her eyes swept the rows and found me at the back. She stopped pretending. Her. She pointed across the room, across all those gray and frightened heads. This is her work. My son's wife. A petty, calculating. She grabbed the gold pen from the podium as if to sign something, to fight, to do anything at all, and her hand was shaking so badly that when the nib touched paper it only smeared a wet black streak and stopped. The pen that had clicked so confidently over my hospital blanket could not make a single coherent mark. I stood up, because the room deserved to see who was answering. I walked to the front the way you walk when you have already won and only have to deliver the last line. The reporters turned. The policyholders turned. I stopped a few feet from her and did not raise my voice. I never do. You told me I was never family, I said, clearly enough for the whole still room to hear. That I was a transitional arrangement. You were right. So I read the whole ledger. The line that doesn't balance is yours. Someone in the rows made a sound. 18 million for 2 signatures, I continued, level and even. You called it a reasonable expense. It turned out to be the most expensive check you ever wrote, because all it purchased was a motivated actuary with time on her hands. But the people I was actually working for in that room were never the Caldwells. I turned my back on Eleanor. I turned to face the room. The woman near the front, the one with a folder of statements, rose on unsteady legs and asked the question every person in that room was holding. Is our care money safe? Eleanor had nothing. She had spent 20 years engineering her life, so she would never be required to answer that question honestly in public. So I answered it. I told them the truth. Plainly. The way my father taught me. The company had not set aside sufficient funds to honor all of its promises. That was real, and they deserved to know it. But the state supervision they had just witnessed arrive was not the catastrophe, it was the intervention. The state stepping in precisely to protect them. I explained how rehabilitation works, how it aims to keep valid policies in force wherever possible. How state guarantee associations exist as a specific backstop for policyholders in exactly this situation, so that the woman on a fixed income who had paid her premiums faithfully for 3 decades would not simply be abandoned. I stood between those frightened people and the family that had wagered them. And for the first time in that company's 100 years, someone at the front of the room was speaking exclusively on their behalf. The examiner beside me gave a small, quiet nod. My numbers and her findings had been telling the same story all along, and that, more than any speech, more than any pointed line, was the moment it was genuinely over. Not because Eleanor had been humiliated, though she had. Because the people she had sold out finally had someone at the front of the room reading them the real figures, in daylight, without apology. The quiet calculator they had paid to disappear was the only honest accounting that family had left. The structure came down quickly after that, the way things do once the load-bearing piece is removed. Caldwell Provident moved from supervision into formal rehabilitation, the state taking full control of its books. The manufactured financial health evaporated within weeks. With it went the family's paper fortune, nearly all of it tied to a company that had been quietly insolvent for years. The trust that Eleanor had fed for decades using dividends drawn from that hollow company now faced clawback proceedings into the estate, a receiver reaching back for money that should never have been distributed. Caldwell House, pledged against the empire, passed out of her hands in the settlement process. And the cruelest arithmetic of all, the one she had gambled her grandchildren and thousands of strangers to avoid, came to pass regardless. Her husband's name, the legacy she had lied for 2 decades to protect, was now in every regional headline adjacent to the word fraud. She had disgraced him in the act of trying to preserve him. She had protected nothing. Marcus faced a professional reckoning of his own. An appointed actuary's initials on a knowingly falsified reserve filing is not something a professional license or a regulator can overlook. The matter was referred to the appropriate authorities. Priya was long gone. Hatch's airtight documents had been the weakest walls in the building. They had been so certain that accumulated wealth made them untouchable that they never once modeled for the only risk that had actually mattered, a quiet woman who knew how to read what the money was hiding. They did it to themselves. Every piece of it. I simply declined to look away, and handed the truth to the people whose job was to act on it, and stepped back while the lie collapsed under its own enormous manufactured weight. The custody matter, the thing that had started everything, ended almost as an afterthought, which is exactly what it deserved. When it reached a real courtroom, with a real judge applying the only standard that actually counts in such proceedings, the hospital relinquishment had no chance. No judicial oversight, no sworn testimony, no oath, and the other woman had been physically present in the room. Textbook duress. Their father was immersed in a fraud investigation and had never once fought for his daughters. Their mother was stable, present, and the only adult in the entire story whose money was verifiably clean. The papers Eleanor had purchased for $18 million were worth precisely what I had known they were worth in that hospital bed. Nothing. A judge spoke the last word. The word was that Clover and Rue stayed with me. My settlement held, too, and people are always surprised by this until I walk them through the math. The money had never come from the insurer. It had been paid from the family's personal trust and marital assets, pools the receiver pursuing the insurance fraud had no reach into. And when the divorce was finalized, the court treated the financial division and the custody question as the separate things they always were. The duress had poisoned the one term no parent can legally sell. It hadn't touched a negotiated property division, I had affirmed with open eyes and full information. A court can sever the invalid term and enforce the remainder. That is what happened. I had reserved against even the small probability that it wouldn't. I never needed the reserve. And the strangest development came last. The court-appointed receiver, untangling the wreckage, needed actuaries who understood Caldwell Providence books from the inside out. The obvious problem was hiring the woman who had filed the original complaint. The receiver's counsel raised the issue before I could. So they did it with proper care. I was walled off from anything touching my own divorce or the custody proceedings, retained as an outside consultant through the receiver's formal engagement channel, my work reviewed by an independent actuary the court trusted. Cleared that way, I took it. I used part of that engagement to help backstop the claims servicing operation, so the checks kept going out. So the woman in the front row still received her care. I sign those checks now, honestly, out of what used to be Walter Caldwell's office, while Eleanor watches from the outside with nothing left to sign. And I took back my name. We are the Tumirashid girls now. All three of us. They were so certain that the dangerous person in that hospital room was the one holding the checkbook and the heavy gold pen. They never considered the one in the bed, the one who already understood that numbers, like children, were never property to be purchased. That's how it ended. A pen that wouldn't write. A ledger that wouldn't balance. Two little girls asleep beneath the name that was always theirs. If you've ever been written off as the quiet one, the calculator, the line item, the person nobody thought to read carefully, then you already understand exactly what I did and why. Around here, calm always gets the last word.